Woo! Go as fast as you can, Finn. You ready? Yeah, I'm filming. Go!
Hey yo, hi, hello, I'm Hippie Rat, and on the 30th of July in the year 2011, a pair of assumedly British kids uploaded to YouTube a video titled Finn Takes a Tumble, a test run of their camera where one boy, to be referred to later as James, films his friend Finn as he rides his bicycle down a hill, concluding with the titular tumble. At its front, it's far from a particularly significant video, being a short clip, perhaps one created with the intention of virality, as I suspect the blooper of focus to be a staged gaffe. It is a 30-second time capsule, 10 years old, that I'm sure today represents quite a significant passage of time as these young men likely find themselves to be adults today, proceeding in life, with this hardly observed screenshot somewhere near the midpoint of their lives as of today. However, it also represents an interesting passage of time in the platform through which we observe the video. The highest quality that we can watch this video is 480p, as was the standard for YouTube before their high-definition uploading updates. It's also filmed on the equipment of its time, featuring harsh, bumpy sounds that can be recognized immediately by anyone familiar with the hardware to be James's hand rubbing against the cheap camcorder.
Woo!
These limitations that are commonly avoided by amateur content creators today remain one of the most interesting aspects of earlier YouTube to me. This video could have only been made and preserved in this state of being, in this time, and through these means. For all I know, there might have once even been annotations on this video, and we may never know since YouTube has discontinued that specific service. Now, I understand what you may be thinking. All this pining over poor video quality and passage of time, and for what? A half-a-minute-long clip of a kid not really falling? What is the significance of this? And the sheer act of this line of questioning makes me very appreciative of what I'm looking at. Because there are some anomalies in this video I have yet to mention that don't quite line up with the anomalies present in its various contemporary counterparts. In the midst of the video, there is one singular camera movement, an intentional pan made to follow the subject, Finn, on his bike. Because of other limitations in YouTube quality, this motion causes the definition to drop somewhat, just as it would as if there were snow or confetti in the image. It's a common issue with moving a camera too quickly in a green outdoors environment, as the landscape shifts and scrambles the interframe compression data. And in this specific instance, this unique kind of motion blur, coupled with our natural instinct to keep our focus on the action, helps to hide a very specific artifact in the background of the video. What appears to be a human figure in dark clothes with an unnaturally pale complexion. This figure is too far from the camera to allow us to recognize any further details about their appearance, assuming there are any further details to see in the first place. The only aspects of note about this figure's appearance is the simple fact that the characters themselves don't seem to note the figure at all, and his entrance in the frame coincides with a long, ringing tone that can be assumed to be some kind of malfunction of the camera, further solidified by the visual malfunction that occurs as the video concludes, where the frame appears to be layered over itself and offset upwards a smidge for a brief moment. This harmless and unassuming video that has remained effectively undiscovered by the general YouTube viewing public for 10 years appears to hold some intriguing mystery, introduced with a surprising level of subtlety that challenges even some of the most popular stories in its subgenre, stories that served as its inspirations. It is my pleasure to introduce to you doingJACKALL, a Slender series made by children. Before we get too far along, I want to take a brief moment to thank you for joining me in this analysis. If you, like me, happen to be a fan of horror netifiction, I cover the genre quite a lot, both here on this channel, as well as on twitch.tv/thehippierat. In fact, for those of you who like these kinds of deep dives on these kinds of topics, you might be excited to hear of 2 projects I'm currently planning for, but I need your help to reach my goals. If we can reach 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2021, I will do a video on the smash hit indie video game Undertale. And if we can reach 20,000 subscribers by the end of 2021, I will do a video on the indie video game Tattletale. Yeah, that thing I keep calling trash without further elaboration. If we reach this goal, I will give you that elaboration. If we don't happen to reach these goals in time, don't worry, I'll still do the videos. It's just that the goals to reach are going to be properly adjusted. But you can help to push that process forward by clicking that subscribe button right now. Thank you very much. Now that that's through with, we can do Jack-all. Now, the history of doingJACKALL goes a little further back than the series' first installment. That history, of course, centers around the mysterious figure of the Slender Man himself. A mere 2 years previous, on June 10th, 2009, Eric Knudsen created his entries into an amateur Photoshop contest on the online discussion forums Something Awful, following the prompt of hoaxing paranormal images. These images of his featured a tall figure, humanoid, yet off in some less than discernible way, nearly completely hidden in the background of said images. Some basic trends or rules of this character were somewhat implied by these 2 images, as both prominently feature children surrounding him, suggesting the character to be a sort of Pied Piper figure. Accompanied with these 2 images are some brief captions, further connecting themes of mass control, fire, and oncoming tragedy to his lore, developing the Slender Man to be some form of a shepherd, harbinger, or just an element of chaos. Now, this is vague, right? This mysterious figure exists in and of itself on a spectrum of meaning, interpretation, and motivation. It is a blank page, hence why the Slender Man would have lended itself greatly into adaptation. Slender Man himself is a prompt for a story. He can be just about anything within reason. And this is what led Troy Wagner to, a mere week and a half later, begin uploading an unfiction webseries inspired by the character, titled Marble Hornets. The content of Marble Hornets is perhaps a good focus for another day, but the cultural impact it had is most important to today's discussion. Being the first horror film project focused on creating a story based on the Slender Man, or the Operator in this case, many other people were inspired by it to create their own adaptations of the character, and this brought with it specific elements that became mainstays of the character's lore, slightly tweaked in every adaptation for the purposes of their own stories. Some of these mainstays included visual symbols, random or incidental upload schedules, alternate reality game elements, and minor antagonists with stylized characterizations that seemed to be hypnotized into service of the Slender Man, a phenomenon that would since be referred to as proxies. And as a handful of these amateur film series became hits in their own right, the simplicity of the design of a Slender Man web series like Marble Hornets drew more and more people towards making their own, something that can still be seen occurring today, although much less commonly. This storytelling form, that has since become known by the very specific term of Slender series, has become so popular that there are nearly 500 individual pieces of unfiction listed on the Slenderverse wiki alone, and perhaps hundreds more that remain undocumented. Everyman Hybrid, Dark Harvest 00, Stan Fredericks, My Dark Journal, even Marble Hornets itself and its sister uploader To the Ark appear on this list, amidst hundreds of unremarkable derivatives that saw nowhere near the success they did, many of which are completely defunct today. So, why this one? Why doingJACKALL? What exactly is of note in this series that makes it the one that I'm dedicating my time and energy to? Well, the answer to that is simple. It's the one that I happened to click on. Consider it fate, consider it random chance, the roulette has landed on doingJACKALL, just one in the crowd, picked by accident to be our example case study in undiscovered and unappreciated Slender series, so that we can explore the comparisons it holds to its more popular inspirations, as well as try and discover what new directions it may take its story. From a cursory glance, it would seem that the most significant inspiration was Everyman Hybrid, although we will dive into deeper narrative comparison to Marble Hornets in a bit. Both series have similar titling styles, small phrases stacked into one word, with the second half of the name stylized in all caps. The previously described introductory video, Finn Takes a Tumble, also borrows the rather genius hook from Everyman Hybrid, which opens as a fitness and dietary advice YouTube channel, creating this false narrative of the unassuming mundane, only for the Slender Man to mysteriously appear in the background of these videos intermittently, coupled with occasional technical errors, until finally this background element interrupts the goings-on of the main characters and hijacks the story going forward. As we saw from doingJACKALL, the unassuming mundane is built of the stage gaffe made for viral intent, yet a mystery is built by the Slender Man's subtle appearance. Heck, even the phrase doingJACKALL can be seen as a humorous subversion of Everyman Hybrid's fitness-based content. We see another of these unassuming mundane events in the second video, Playing with Linus, depicting mostly the point of view shot of presumably James tugging a rope with his dog, intercut with a non sequitur sequence of the camera holder and another person approaching a staircase and looking up it to reveal the Slender Man once again. This then leads to a video titled Number 0, Introduction. And it's here where I can point out a bit of the structural issue that is a direct result of the derivative nature of this series. This video makes note of the strange figure caught in the last two videos, and opens the question of what exactly it is. And then a couple videos later, Finn explains that he took over the channel in order to try and document further appearances of this mysterious figure. That decision isn't clarified until then, however, which brings into question why the numbering convention began with the introduction video. What it comes across as is the decision to number videos just because Marble Hornets entries were numbered, without full consideration of why the characters felt any reason to number the videos themselves. This is also the first video to borrow the text-on-screen style of narration from Marble Hornets, which seems directly contrasting with the established reality of the characters having the means to speak through their camera. Jay also has the means to do so, but he has no reason to during the majority of Season 1. And going forward, it's reasonable for him to continue this style of exposition as a means of upholding consistency with the precedent set. In this show, the actual footage shown in introduction depicts an inaudible conversation about the mysterious figure, and filming this conversation would have been a conscious decision. So there's little to no reason to tell this part of the story through text when we could have just been given the audio of their conversation and their request for emails on the issue through the footage itself. The fourth video is titled Number 1, which isn't true, First Sighting, which isn't true. It is just a series of shots of Finn walking around the woods and then coming across Slender Man. The video has no dialogue, commentary, or anything aside from the description. Took a shortcut, which explains nothing about the context of the video. This does add a layer of mystery to the footage, but the mystery at play is what is the purpose of any of this? The video also cuts to random points in this walk through the woods, which means two possible things are happening. On one hand, maybe he recorded the entire walk through the woods and there's maybe 10 minutes of footage that was cut out. This would then suggest that the random clips we do see are significant in some way, but this does not appear to be the case. On the other hand, these clips could all be separate instances he randomly decided to hit record on the camera, perhaps expecting something to happen at these moments before turning the camera off mere seconds later, which isn't particularly efficient, and makes suspension of disbelief difficult in the case when he does turn on the camera at the end for the clip where he just so happened to spot the Slender Man standing on the other side of the wall. I consider these sorts of plot hole issues a direct result of an attempt to add a sort of realism to their found footage horror. After all, home videos like this aren't created with the same filmmaking prowess you see out of a purposefully crafted project, and so some of the footage that is presented as having been discovered in whatever context the fiction suggests is naturally going to feel less purposeful than your typical film. Take, for example, the nighttime shots in Paranormal Activity, which demonstrate the fact that there is plentiful footage of nothing occurring by famously speeding it up as the characters toss and turn in their sleep. In this case, however, there is reason for the creator to only demonstrate the relevant footage while providing the context of a walk in the woods through narration of some sort, or to perhaps even go all out and show the entire uncut walk in the woods leading up to this sighting of the Slender Man to really sell the realism of the scene. Instead, the random momentary B-roll of trees feel like an afterthought. Number 2, an update, is where Finn explains that he'll be filming every moment of his life as a result of the suggestions of viewers and his research into the Slender Man, which suggests in fiction that this character is similarly familiar with contemporary Slender series, just as the creators must have been. This was actually another established reality in the case of Slender series. Crossover episodes were a very common thing, something that didn't particularly make a lot of sense due to the different ways the operator operated throughout these series. The interactive nature of horror metafiction made Slender Man effectively the spider in an interwoven web of narratives that each serve their own purpose, despite being singular instances in a larger conspiracy. And this made acknowledgement of the Slender Man as an extant entity in new emerging Slender series standard practice. I actually think the manner in which this series did it is rather interesting, demonstrating Finn's research as just another thing he films in his day-to-day life. Nearly blink and you miss it, an Easter egg in the background. He doesn't make a big deal out of showing it, you can just tell by what you can make out on the screen what he's doing, what he's learning about the Slender Man, and what information he actively has access to. The description of this episode states simply, "Somnis est cum uno oculo aperto." This is Google Translate for sleep with one eye open. Seeing as Finn now has control of the channel, I am to assume he left this description as a threat directed towards me and me alone. In number 3, James is back. Finn is continuing to film everything when suddenly he gets a visitor. James has returned and is puzzled by Finn's camera nearly instantly. We then see random moments as they head to a convenience store to buy a bag of crisps, during which James gets increasingly frustrated with Finn's insistence to keep filming. The video ends with the two of them sitting in the grass, having a conversation that is drowned out by audio interference, coinciding with the appearance of the Slender Man in the background, who rapidly approaches the two unsuspecting kids. The description of the video is, "I can't remember," implying that Finn and/or James have failed to recall these events leading up to the apparent attack that the video closes with, nor whatever events might have followed it. Number 4, It's Closer, features one 30-second clip of presumably Finn entering his room and checking his surroundings before grabbing a video game, only to turn around and see the Slender Man approach from the hallway. He makes a motion to cower in one corner of the room, at which point the Slender Man walks in. The video cuts off before we see what could have happened, and the description says, "Ismos nunquam subsisto." It will never stop. Perhaps the tormentous taunting of the attacker, perhaps the despondent wailing of the victim. Either way, it's written in a dead language, so if you didn't think it was spooky before, then I don't know how to finish this sentence. Number 5, Acting Weird, is one that owes a lot to the equipment it was filmed on. The cheap camcorder provides this really distinct aesthetic with these really crushed darker areas and blurry smeared bright spots. That, paired with the audio design of this strange, nearly mechanical whirring sound set looping in the foreground, creates this spooky, otherworldly vibe. The video shows a series of disjointed clips, starting with Finn walking into a room, shuttering the blinds, and turning on a television to watch, presumably Candle Cove. Then Finn scribbling the famed operator symbol on a piece of paper before adding it to a pile of other pages borrowed from Marble Hornets and Slender the 8 Pages. Footage of a closed bedroom door being knocked on by an unseen figure, and finally one last clip of Finn intently staring into television static. Clearly, at this point, Finn has succumbed to the Slender Man's thrall and has begun his transformation into a proxy of the Slender Man's will. This sequence clearly also owes much to the existing imagery associated with the character. Ironically, while the base channel concept seems to be inspired mostly by Everyman Hybrid, the Marble Hornets' influence is unshakable here. This comes across as somewhat confused, since the operator symbol only properly applies to the operator, the version of the Slender Man from Marble Hornets, which is a cultural outlier in that it is perhaps the singular Slender series that cannot be reasonably tied into the interconnected canon of other big Slender series due to a lack of elements that cross over quite the same way those other series would allow themselves to cross over with each other. This video ends with the incidental handoff of the channel back over to James, who caps it off with a vlog explaining that he found the previous clips on the camera, and he assumes they connect to the other videos uploaded to the channel. The video description, now apparently written by James, states, "I don't know what to do." James's re-ownership of the channel doesn't last long, as we see from his next video in the series, number 6, Videmur Indigere Auxilio. We're once again shown POV footage of a walk in the woods, this much more frantic and paranoid than that shown in First Sighting, and amplified by the low lighting of late dusk. Very little can be made out in the footage aside from heavy breathing, a darting flashlight, and the sound of the camera being absolutely manhandled until suddenly the flashlight beam comes to a rest over a bloody body strung out across a tree. The strange whirring sound is replaced with an unnatural screech, and the person holding the camera turns to run away. Our suspicions regarding the familiar-looking body are confirmed by the description of the video. It was James. This is a very short video series made up of a bunch of very short videos, so a lot of the plot points are being cycled through in rapid succession of each other. It kinda hurts the pacing, making it feel not only like the replication of other Slender Man series, but like the abridging of such a concept to its most basic story beats. This is kind of a common issue with these kinds of series. While larger contemporaries like Marble Hornets and Everyman Hybrid are focused so much more on making sure the audience spends time getting to know the characters and thus feel attached to them, many knockoffs created by kids fail to give their characters similar treatment, and they're instead focused on speedrunning the Slender Man spectacle. Yeah, these kids are thrown into a scary scenario, but it's hard to feel concern for them. There is very little character given to them, nor the time to have even attempted to develop their characters. That said, there is some praise to be given to the abruptness of this plot beat. The assumption to be made of the previous episode is that James would now pick up as the main protagonist going forward, only to be immediately dispatched before the events of this video, which just leaves us with the question of who uploaded this video and why. Well, it's easy to come to the conclusion that this is Finn, presumably having broken from his hypnotized state mere moments earlier, leaving him lost in the woods with no understanding of how he got there, only to stumble on James's body, which he recognizes, and get chased off by the Slender Man. On its own, it's a pretty interesting form of implied storytelling, but I question the course of actions taken. What is gained from running home, plugging your camcorder into your computer, and uploading this footage to YouTube.com with seemingly no intention to call the police, rather than the fair assumption that you would be the prime suspect if you were to call the police? It just doesn't seem like the best snap decision. In fact, it barely feels like a snap decision at all. You may remember the title of this video, Videmur Indigere Auxilio. This is another Latin translation, this time meaning, we need help. And there's just something so astoundingly silly about this to me. Imagine being stalked by some supernatural killer, but before you send your SOS out for all the internet to see, you take some time beforehand to go to Google Translate, wasting precious seconds to turn this desperate plea for help into a puzzle to solve. Like, there's already the well-established trope of using ciphers for absolutely no reason in unfiction, gaining a minimal amount of viewer investment in the game by having them decode messages that convey absolutely zero supplementary meaning to the piece at hand, but there's something just that much funnier about the message being something that you would so desperately want anyone to understand without them having to think about it. The next episode, number 7, Looking for James, with the description, I went back, shows Finn doing just that, returning to the woods the next morning to find James. On the outskirts of the woods, he sees a message scratched onto some rocks from the Slender Man, telling him not to go any further. At the tree, there is no sign of James, aside from his own camera nearby. Finn returns to his home to study the footage on that camera. This footage has much of the same distortion seen in Acting Weird as James transits across town to visit Finn. He ends up heading into the woods late in the evening to find Finn, but as soon as he gets close enough, Finn attacks James, and the scene ends with the camera on the ground in the position Finn found it the next day. Finn finishes the video with more on-screen text explaining that he doesn't know why he would have attacked James, nor does he remember doing it at all. and that this was the last he saw of James for the week between finding the camera and uploading the video. It's a very simple video explaining a lot of what we were left to assume in the previous. There was little doubt that Finn, hypnotized under the Slender Man's will, was responsible for James's battered state, but this uncovered footage confirms this. It's not uncommon for Slender series to demonstrate an event only to recontextualize it with a different perspective through discovered footage, but I think this specific example is kind of a perfect storm. Earlier in the series, James taunted Finn for his constant filming, but it makes sense for him to be filming his own life now after seeing the footage and acting weird. The entire sequence remains stylistically consistent with the rest of the series, with the same type of editing that shows short bursts of footage entirely to demonstrate the travel leading to the climactic scene. Even the continuity of the camera landing in the same position it's recovered in is something I'm impressed to see, as it's one of those details I can imagine most of this show's more popular peers failing to account for. Number 8, Visit, begins with a retroactive update explaining that a few hours before, James's 12-day disappearance had seemed to end. The footage showing this encounter begins with Finn getting up to walk to his room. The scene parallels the motions he took upon entering his room in It's Closer, subtly communicating to us that his paranoia has become routine for him. This time, when he checks out the window, he sees James sitting in front of his house. He shouts to get his attention, only for James to run away upon being noticed. What follows is a sequence of Finn chasing James across the neighborhood, out into a field, into the woods, until finally James turns a corner to hide in an abandoned hut in the woods. Finn follows him, only for James to somehow not be in the hut he just entered, leaving behind a scrap of paper. The paper reads, "He sees you." And sure enough, Finn turns his attention to a gap in the walls where the Slender Man can be seen peeking in. Finn makes a run for it, making it home, only to see that his house was broken into while he was gone, and James's camera had been stolen from him. The video ends with one last thought that Finn had. James seemed to have been deliberately leading Finn to the hut. The description is nothing but 4 forward slashes, perhaps communicating that the video speaks for itself. And indeed it does, showing now that the tables have turned. Finn and James now seem to have developed a sort of Hoodie and Masky dynamic. The difference is that while Hoodie and Masky would seem to throw each other under the bus that is the Slender Man at times while trying to fight against his thrall, Finn and James seem to be doing much of the same thing to each other with much less purpose. In Marble Hornets, there was a medication that allowed those under the operator's control to combat it. But in doingJACKALL, there is little in the way of explaining why Finn is no longer under direct control of the Slender Man. In Marble Hornets, Brian stealing the pills and watching as Tim gets put under the control of the operator builds upon his character and expands on the mysteries in the series, but in doingJACKALL, the Slender Man just kinda slips up and forgets about Finn after capturing James, and now he has to go through with the process of capturing Finn again. Number 9, Presence, once again shows a different perspective of previous events, although this time they are events filmed concurrently to footage we've seen. Taken from James's perspective, he activates the camera after taking it from Finn's room, but on the way out, he narrowly avoids being spotted by Finn. This is one of those moments in Slender series that normally benefits from showing the other person with their camera in the background of the previous video. But James doesn't happen to be visible as Finn enters his home and visit, because the contrast in that footage is just too high. However, Finn's movements as he films the house after James's robbery do match up to the parallel scene in Visit, which is still fun despite this scene not living up to similar gimmicks in its contemporaries. After James escapes Finn's house, the video cuts to more footage from James's point of view stalking Finn, coinciding with the description of this video, the single word, watching. The video concludes with footage of James crossing a field alone, only to be attacked by the Slender Man. James then uploads the video to the channel himself, and it's the last we hear of either character for some time. Presents, like all preceding videos, had been uploaded a mere handful of days after the previous, and up to this point, doingJACKALL had a pretty consistent run between July 30th and September 12th of 2011, nearly a month and a half. More than 2 months passed before the next upload, number 10. Timeline. After a rapid series of cuts to various pieces of footage, Finn is once again here for an expository info dump. Over the past couple months, his memory of the events around the doingJACKALL channel had been completely erased, right down to his ownership of the channel. On November 24th, the night before this video was uploaded, Finn found a series of video files on his computer that led him to rediscovering the channel and uncovering the mysterious circumstances around James's disappearance earlier that year. The rest of the video is his attempt to make sense of what he's watching, and how the appearances of the strange figure connect to James's disappearance. Part of this video plays to me like Finn and James grew tired of or forgot to make any further updates to doingJACKALL for some time, only to decide later on that they wanted to create some kind of conclusion to the series, which is more than I can say of most abandoned Slender series. As such, this almost feels like a recap episode a television show might air after a season break, which perhaps makes sense to those abruptly reminded of the series months after it went radio silent, but when binging the series today, all this does is confirm to those confused by episode 9 that Presence was indeed filmed and uploaded by James, as well as highlight what details Finn thinks are going to be relevant for the final 2 episodes. As he puts it in the description, "This is what I can piece together." Now, it's not unusual for Slender series to take long breaks between uploads and chalk the break up to memory loss, onset by the Slender Man's powers, and the fact that it's once again something that it's not unusual for Slender series to do just reads to me like this series is collecting plot points from Marble Hornets like they were goddamn Pokemon. Number 11, James, comes a few days later and shows heavily distorted footage from Finn walking at night when he encounters James again. James chases Finn for some time, and when he catches up to him, James tries to gauge where the Slender Man is and when Finn last saw it. When he learns that Finn can't remember anything, he gives him a memory card with a video file on it, as well as an ultimatum regarding the next time they meet, the details of which are cut out by audio distortion. The video file, titled Finn 115, shows James continuing to stalk Finn, much closer than he had been several months before. At the end of the video, Finn can be seen at the top of a hill in silhouette, seeming to be subservient to a much taller, more slender silhouette. The tall silhouette takes notice of James and Finn chases him off. The description of the video, "He's still following me," manages to ambiguously refer to both James and the Slender Man at once. Thus, as part of this final act, a big plot twist reveals James to have somehow once again traded proxy status with Finn, and now his stalking has shifted from serving as bait for bringing Finn back to the Slender Man, to instead serving as his own investigation into the Slender Man. Now, in studying this series so closely, I'm almost convinced that you should be able to deduce what shifts characters in and out of proxy influence. Ironically, it would almost seem that having a camera on you filming your actions weakens the Slender Man to some degree, which nearly runs counter to the rules in most other Slender series, where the Slender Man's distortion of cameras is simply a byproduct of his proximity and seems to have no influence one way or the other regarding his approach. In both Videmur, Indigere, Auxilio, and Timeline, Finn's reclaiming of the camera after some time not filming his everyday life immediately follows his time being under the Slender Man's influence, suggesting that to be what snapped him out of it. And you can make a similar conclusion about James stealing his camera back in Presence. Of course, as interesting and subversive that is, it seems coincidental, as it's the camera tests at the opening of the series that immediately sets off the chain of events, beginning with the Slender Man's first appearance, and the camera's constant recording of Finn's everyday life does seemingly nothing to stop the Slender Man from first taking him as a proxy. Now, in that penultimate video, James gives Finn an ultimatum for what to do when next they meet, but that ultimatum goes unheard and is left a mystery, just as the cause for the shifting of the Slender Man's influence is kept a mystery. Well, 11 days later, we see exactly what these mysteries have been building up to. Number 12. Confine. In this, Finn catches a glimpse of the Slender Man outside of his house, and when he tries to escape, it blocks the door. Finn hides in the bathroom for a moment, and when it seems things have died down, he returns to the hallway, only for the Slender Man to attack. The series ends. It's over. Abadi. That's all, folks. Yes, it's that simple. No answered questions, no realization of the ultimatum, just a clip of another skinny boy attack, the description of which simply states, "I'm leaving." Like Finn just rage quit the production of his Slender series. I know it's easy to play Monday morning quarterback to a series made by children 10 years ago, but it really feels like they gift-wrapped themselves a much better finale. Some big confrontation between Finn and James, perhaps a character death, and even a final twist that reveals the Slender Man to have been victorious in the end. But instead, this entire YouTube series just moved to a farm upstate. Perhaps there's a sort of realism to this. You know, there isn't really a high likelihood of a reel of found footage having a satisfying, candid conclusion, rather than just kinda randomly running out of footage that was found. If you ignore the misstep of the creators building towards some more clear conclusion, and instead focus on the decision to end on this random attack, it almost feels like a sort of acceptance of this series having less of a literary significance when compared to the more allegorical, philosophical, or critical pieces that I've been comparing it to today. Without those elements, doingJACKALL plays like a non-satirical Rosencrantz and Guildenstern of Slender Man mythos, a slice of Slender Man's life outside of his time coughing on film students or dealing with habits shenanigans. After all, Slender Man can't always be deep and meaningful. Sometimes, he has to just make some random British kids brawl in the middle of the woods. When you can't watch the world burn, you settle for watching a kid fall off of his bicycle. And maybe there's a value there. As with the plentiful other Slender series, made by kids that similarly lack that purposed creative vision. Now, I may not be expected to dump as much brain power into this as I am with bigger Slender series, but that doesn't mean this series was without its really solid moments. There's this line they rode with the production of this series right along the edge of their capabilities at the time of making this, where sometimes things predictably wouldn't land well, but other times they get a square-on hit on some of the finer details that make a good horror piece so good. As I've discussed already, there are moments where the distortion creates this otherworldly mood, selling me on the premise that the Slender Man has taken control in some way. The editing style began as obtrusive and illogical, but by the end I came to appreciate its design and the way it suggested this transition in location and progression of time. And while the Slender Man doesn't look like the most imposing gentleman in the first few episodes, as the series continued, these kids' special effects had improved quite enough for the mysterious figure to properly come into its own as a threatening and powerful force. You can argue that the good parts are only there because they're taking from the good parts in other Slender series, but I think that's an unfair underrating of the piece at hand for what may come across as a surprising reason. Most horror creators may not like to say this, but no horror is original. Every piece of horror really does boil down to the same main parts, because we as humans have already figured out what is scary and what makes those scary things scary. Even a horror piece that feels entirely original is still a calculated mutation of existing horror pieces. Most of this is done subconsciously, hence why there can be so much alteration between an influence and a new piece, and why there's so much variation in presentations among these pieces. The wide array of genres, different symbolic motifs, and the vast list of tropes and archetypes help to tell new stories, but they all branch off of the same core facets of horror. But this all begs the question that if this story can be seen as so similar to those that influence it while lacking much of the same nuance and purpose to it, what exactly is the significance of the piece at hand? And truly, the reason I am so fascinated by this piece is that it serves as a clear demonstration of the mindset of the creative youth. Something I believe has much worth in studying. What plays off in the mind of a kid replicating a piece of media that nabbed their attention is the purest boiling down of the elements of the original piece into the base forms of iconography, fear, and passion. These elements are worth studying from a psychological perspective in much the same way we like to analyze our own personal experiences of horror moments in media that affected us as children, and through that we can better understand the effect of fear on the mind in their rawest distillment. Many of the finer details and abstract pieces may go over their heads, but what matters is this: the translation of the parts that stuck with them. Marble Hornets has a dense literary subtext lending to many meanings and interpretations, from the contempt people can hold towards the mentally and physically ill, to the insidious nature of paranoia and how it leads to an obsessive personality, to the rather apt meaning of the objective fact that film students deserve to be hunted for sport. Everyman Hybrid similarly can be read under the lenses of the way evil forms in a person, or where the line between fiction and reality exists, or even as a sort of religious ascension. Dark Harvest 00 primarily explores investigation into and antagonization from cults. Stan Fredericks recontextualizes and satirizes the tropes of the Slender series multiverse, and doingJACKALL is just the familiar symbols and scares because those are what had impact to the kids who were influenced by series like these. I would be remiss in ignoring entirely the fact that this is a double-edged sword, as horror metafiction, pieces of horror widely spread by use of the internet, and designed in a meta form to suggest them to be reflected in the reality in which we exist on, can be dangerous when exposed to suggestible youth who struggle to debunk them as fictional on their own. Yes, there's a value in seeing what a child takes away from a creepypasta and what specific core intricacies are reflected in their OCs, and I don't want to suggest that this should be completely thrown away from study, but I recognize the distinct issue with children seeing Slender Man videos and building a real religious connection to the mythical being, especially children susceptible to or having history of mental illness. I don't want to linger too much on the infamous Slender Man stabbing, as I feel this to be a fringe case that can be properly prevented so long as focus is put not into the censorship of horror netafiction, but in the establishment of better mental care infrastructure. However, I definitely feel that there does deserve to be a responsible treatment of these kinds of works and their distribution so that kids can walk away feeling creatively motivated rather than dangerously illusioned. See, I recognize the importance in approaching a child's mentality with the understanding that it has certain limitations that necessitate a responsible exposure of certain materials, but I want to wholeheartedly advocate that this not be done in a way to impede their creative expression. I look at projects like these and I feel an immense pride for these kids. And do you know why? It's because I have been in their shoes. I've been on so many camping trips where my sister and I have gone out and played Slender Man, which was more or less a paranormal investigation game where we'd walk around and scare each other into thinking any random tree or light post in the distance was the Slender Man. This character served as much of my initial exploration into what horror was, and it's so comforting to go and see a record of media in which my peers of the time were doing much of the same thing. And I go on YouTube and I see some children making Slender series today, or moving on to fan-made Siren Head projects or Petscop clones, and it just revitalizes this motivation in me to create. And I watch these excited to see how their creativity will evolve as they grow up. And I study them to see what they take away from similar projects. And I finished this video. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, I want to ask you to check to see if you're subscribed. It'll mean so much if we can reach those subscriber goals this year. Consider supporting me on Patreon, where you'll get updates on upcoming projects and videos. Follow me on Twitter at HippieRat, and follow me on twitch.tv/thehippierat. I'll see you all soon, but in the meantime, love yourself, and good night.